Hello and welcome to our last edition here with Bob O'Neill, talking about and dissecting Whitaker's Lessons of a Decade. So the last chapter we're going to be covering is picketing, kind of picketing in general, and maybe a little bit of forest picketing. So again, I'd like to welcome for the last time, at least for a little while, Mr. Bob O'Neill. Thanks for joining us again.
It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Awesome.
I'm enjoying
so
it.
Again, if you haven't seen our previous videos, please go ahead and watch them. They're really interesting. Bob definitely has a good take on those chapters. But for now, the last one, like I said, we'll just get right into it. As far as picketing, now he really in the chapter he kind of skips over kind of a lot of the basics of picketing, go straight into the issues of forest picketing. But to kind of set the stage, I just kind of want to talk about picketing in general and really how the infantry and the cavalry viewed picketing. And when we're talking picketing, we're not talking picket line with the horse grazing in a circle. We're talking about the duty of guarding, the flanks or guarding the army.
Guarding the army.
So what kind of how would you introduce what picketing was, and really the argument or the dichotomy between the infantry and the cavalry and the duties of each?
I think it's one of the things that kind of crept in early on that diminished the role of the cavalry in the mind, the Union cavalry in the mind of the Union infantry. If the army did not have faith in the volunteer cavalry, then they were going to shunt them aside to minor duty.
Right.
And so part of their task became picket duty. And picket duty is, as you said, guarding the army, guarding terrain features, river crossings, fords, bridges, access points to the army. And in my mind, I kind of lump a lot of things together as pickets.
Yeah.
In reality, there was a litany of different names
Right.
But it was essentially the way I would describe it is a collapsing defensive formation where you had out closest to the enemy a very thin line of pickets. In the terminology today, the most exterior part of the line was vedettes.
Right.
But I don't see where most of the men use that term. It all kind of became lumped together as pickets.
It really, and in fact, one thing that I've noticed is the vedettes. I've really only seen that term used widely on the cavalry side of things, and really don't see it much on the infantry side of things.
Right, and even the cavalrymen they just kind of revert to pickets.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so I've fallen into the same trap.
Yeah.
That it's all picket duty to me.
Yeah.
And there was, as they came back towards the army, those details would get stronger.
Right.
So you had grand guard and reserve posts and things like that. And there was an order of how things were to work. In the Union Army, that, as I said, kind of fell to cavalry very quickly. And it became a point that the infantry didn't want to participate in, and it became almost a matter of pride, jealousy, whatever.
Yeah.
But it worked to I believe, the detriment of the Union cavalry. If they're on picket duty all the time, they're not resting their horses. The orders were that those men on duty, and a certain number of all the men on picket duty had to be on their horse.
Right.
And a certain number were allowed to be back resting. But they had to be in the saddle for the whole period of time they were going to be on duty. So they're not resting, the horse isn't resting, they're out in the elements, they're out in mud. All the elements you know better than I do about a horse standing in mud is going to lead to hoof problems and other diseases and things like that. It spread them out farther from the line of supply. It took more effort to get horse to forage and fodder out to them. So there was a lot of detriment, and most importantly, it kept them from training.
Yeah, and we were talking about that before.
Right.
So I guess go into that as far as the training aspect. If they're out on picket duty, then they don't have the time to train.
Right, and we're not talking about, when you're looking at cavalry, you didn't just train a man, you needed to train in formation. You needed to train the way you fought, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, but you had squadron drill, company drill,
Right, yeah.
battalion drill.
You need all those.
And you need to know all of them, and you need to be able to move in those. You need enough ground to do all that on. And so if you're breaking up squadrons and one squadron's out on picket duty and they're not be able to train the way they're going to fight, because a squadron is going to fight as a squadron. They had to know each other, and a lot of those things worked to the detriment. Well, the South took a little bit different view of it. They worked things more fairly, I think, where the infantry and the cavalry both assumed picket duty, and for a lot of reasons, in the wintertime especially, Lee and Stewart and others would let their cavalry go entirely away from the army. Turn the horses loose. They were they weren't under a saddle and under a man for long periods of time. They were on their, allowed to graze on their own in open pasture for a long period of time to recover their strength and rest the men, rest the horses, and the infantry then shared the duty. So one of the things I wanted to read to that point is in the order, and we've talked about, used parts of this already a couple of times. So in the order from the Secretary of War in June, I like the date, June 9th. This is 1 year after the Battle of Brandy Station. This is part of the order that deals with picket duty. And they wrote, cavalry should always be kept in reserve for critical and important service. It should never be required to do duty which can be performed as well by infantry. To send cavalry on picket duty in order that infantry may rest is an improper use of cavalry. There is no picket duty that cannot be performed by infantry. During the season of rest or inactivity, cavalry should be fostered and trained for legitimate duty. Well, in fact, that's the exact opposite of what happened. So as a counter to that, almost exactly 1 year earlier, June 8th, 1863, all the cavalry has been organized and brought into position to make the morning attack across Beverly's Ford and Kelly's Ford and lead to the fight at Brandy Station. In order to fill in for the cavalry pickets being brought off the picket line, the infantry had to go forward and fill that role. And this is in the official records, on June 8th, as Pleasanton, and I'm kind of paraphrasing to set the stage, as Pleasanton concentrated his men for battle, Major General Carl Schurz, commanding a division in the 11th Corps, disparaged Pleasanton and his cavalry to Corps Commander Major General Oliver Howard, and quote, I would request you to protest against this conduct of the commander of the cavalry, who calls us out for his support and then withdraws his forces and obliges us to do picket service for the cavalry. That's the degree to which things had denigrated, that they just assumed that it was, like their birthright.
Right.
Look, we're going out and doing the majority of the work in battle.
Right.
Got it. I understand that. That we shouldn't have to do anything else. But it made it that much harder for the cavalry to assume their part in battle.
Yeah, exactly.
If they're not being trained to do it.
I find that interesting. So what you just read before about the order, so that was, so basically sorry, who was that commander?
Carl Schurz, the one, the division infantry commander?
Sorry. No, the one that was talking about that there is no...
that's the order from Secretary of War Edwin Stanton.
Secretary of War, okay. So that he said that there's no duty that basically infantry...
Should be doing picket duty all the time.
Bar none, all the time. And then it's interesting how from that context then, or from that statement, the exact opposite was going on in the field.
Exactly.
Why do you think the commanders in the field just defaulted to using cavalry for pickets and not the infantry?
I think it goes back to the early days of McClellan when he had no faith in the cavalry, in the volunteer cavalry. And he goes, well, we need somebody to do this. I'll husband my infantry for battle. These men aren't trained. We don't know that they're going to even keep cavalry very long. Right. Yeah. So let's just shunt them off to courier duty and escort duty and picket duty. And it became a habit. It just became, as commanders changed and it filters down and go, well, I'm not going to go out there and do that. That's what cavalry does.
Yeah.
And it becomes ingrained.
Yeah, exactly. So let's say, whether it was against Stanton's original plan or not, that maybe prompted him to write that order later on. When we talked previously on the weapons episode, that early on in the war, the cavalry only had basically sabers and pistols, or maybe a rifle or a carbine. Were cavalry, especially on the federal side, were they effective as pickets? or ineffective, or was it like a checking a box, like, yeah, we got pickets, but really, if something happened, we wouldn't really be able to receive it. We wouldn't be able to put up a defensive struggle. So how effective was Federal cavalry as pickets then, especially early on in the war?
I don't think across the board you can say that they were effective. Okay. The more training they had, the more veteran they were, the more comfortable they were with that role, they would be more effective, the more battle hardened they had been. So it's not like cavalrymen had never been in battle. Right. But as new regiments came on, then they're just shunted to picket duty. Yeah. So they were being rushed, and the Army wasn't raised the way we think of men today. You don't go to a long boot camp or period of training, and the exigencies of war dictated how quickly they were brought from their home state to the battlefront. And so, by example, the Army in the spring of '62, early summer, had shut down a lot of the recruiting depots because they thought with the success in the West at that point, and with McClellan being on the doorstep of Richmond, that the war was going to come to a successful conclusion pretty quick. So let's save money and not bring any more men into service. And then, of course, things don't turn out the way they thought it was going to happen. And so they had to reopen them very quickly, hurriedly bring men in to the ranks. And then you start having a series of debacles, to include the disaster at Fredericksburg. And when that happens, in particular, 2 regiments are hurried from training camp, the 16th and 17th Pennsylvania. Yeah. And one of them, the colonel of the 16th, will protest. He said, I don't even have boots for my men. My men have no weapons. They have no training. He uses, and I don't have all that to read directly, but he uses the phrase, my men are a mob. And that's his word. Mm-hmm. And nothing but disaster will follow. They need time in Washington away from the war front to get acclimated to what their duties are going to be. And the Army said, no, we can't afford not to have you here. Come down. And then they were put immediately onto picket duty. Right. So there's no training. And they have no idea. The officers don't have any idea. But what I do have is from the 17th Pennsylvania, so a sister regiment brought down the same time, raised the same time, Lieutenant Colonel writing to the Corps commander of the Cavalry Corps at the time, George Stone. This is March of 1863. He said, I report to you that my regiment has been in the field now nearly 7 months and has never yet received carbines. The requisitions have been put in at different times for them, and it appears they cannot be had. More importantly, I think, is this. I would also state that we are entirely out of pistol cartridges and have had none since the first day of February. So this is a month and a half, roughly, that they've had no pistol cartridges. And they don't have any carbines. So the only other weapon is a saber, right. And that's probably completely ineffective on picket duty. Yeah. Since that time, he continues, we've been doing picket duty and the outpost and patrol duty from a quiet church to Dumfries. So that's part of the battle line around the Army there. I filed a requisition for cartridges about the 7th day of February with the ordnance officer of the 11th Army Corps. Interestingly enough, that's the same corps that's going to complain about the cavalry making them do picket duty. I have filed one since that time for ordnance stores, cartridges and such with the Cavalry Corps, and have never received a single cartridge. So that goes on, but you get the sense. And then that's the March 12th. On March 18th, the colonel of the regiment then has to send the following order to his men. Hereafter, no firing of pistols will be allowed under any circumstances whatever, unless by permission of the commanding officers. Sentinels and vedettes on picket duty will not be allowed to fire unless they may deem it proper on the approach of the enemy. So you take brand new troops. Yeah. You put them on sentinel duty guarding the Army with no means to defend themselves. Well, one of the orders, standing orders essentially, in the patrol and picket guideline, which I could actually read to you if I dug it out for a minute, was that if a picket was being overrun, he was to fire his weapon to alert the pickets on the other side of him, who might be several hundred yards away. So depending on the terrain, they may not see what's happening to the man next to them, but they would hear the noise. So now if you take a young trooper and you put him out there by himself in darkness, he's got no confidence in his ability to do anything, and you tell him, look, you've got an empty weapon, and even if you have anything in you have to husband your rounds, you not to just waste them. Well, you put this indecision in his mind, and then you create a problem where what happens, what do I do? And by the time he comes up with a resolution, it's probably too late.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's interesting. So, I mean, even so that report, was what I like is it's a good officer, because in the same report, he identifies a problem in a lot of ways of, hey, we don't have pistols. And you could say, well, you don't need them. Well, we're on picket duty, so we kind of need them. And then just identifies the problem and is pleading to protect his men, basically. So.
Yeah, and we have the impression, I think, that the Union Army just had an abundance of everything compared to their Southern counterparts. A lot of truth to that, but this is part of the proof that it's not
to the extent that
we tend to think it is. Right,
yeah,
exactly.
So, so then talking about that, then, kind of going back with forest picketing, kind of back where Whitaker's talking about, he really makes a distinction between forest picketing and just normal picketing. In fact, he doesn't really even address normal picketing.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. It's just specifically forest picketing. So I kind of want to open up what he said here, and then we can kind of talk about what he specifically identified as problems. He said, in Canada, however, well, you got to love, and talking about we
picking on those Canadians again.
Canadians, right? And you could tell we talked about this in a different episode, but where he thought future wars may have been fought. Actually, I'll start up above. He said, I have thus far treated of pickets on ordinary ground, interspersed with small patches of woods and open fields. This is the general character of the more thickly settled states. However, he says in Canada, as in the southern states, there exists very extensive woods full of tangled underbrush in which oftentimes pickets have to be thrown out. And in this species of country, more than any other, surprises must be guarded against. And he says mounted vedettes are almost useless in these places. And then when you combine that with the idea that he goes on to say that the principles of forest picketing, again, picketing in these dense woods, are modifications of ordinary picketing. And he says the roads must be patrolled as far as possible, as so many men are not needed for vedettes, more are left for patrols. And of course, he said forest patrols should go out at least a mile, and to prevent the surprise and capture by lurking parties of the enemy, they should be about 20 strong mounted men in each patrol. So he goes in to basically describe that based on very dense woods, you want to, extend into the roads more, and then, of course, block the roads where you can, and then send out from that road being the center point, I guess, extend some breastworks or some
barricades or something like that,
along the road on either side. So when he goes into talking about forest picketing, what are your thoughts on just kind of his general, I guess, take on the whole subject?
Well, I think he's pretty much on target. Troops of any kind were not going to easily move in formation, and we know that from Chancellorsville and the Wilderness and other areas where they fought in that kind of, and the cavalry still had to go out and picket those areas.
Yeah.
And I hope, will be able to, as you put this together, show some maps that I've given you.
Yeah.
That actually a picket map from that area around the confluence of the Rapidan and Rappahannock in that area, how some of the pickets were set. Officers going on picket duty would oftentimes draw a map, and they're highly prized by me, if I could put it that way, when I find them, because they show names of homeowners in the area. They give you a road network, and they will describe on there where their men were, what regiments were guarding certain areas, the strength the men were in, where the barricades were. So they will prove essentially what he's saying, that they knew. And there's something they had to figure out. There's a fight I describe in the Chasing Jeb Stuart and Mosby book where I think in some cases it's referred to as a fight through the barricades. It's almost like what we see now after 9/11 when entry points to key buildings, were set up to force a zigzag pattern to slow anybody coming towards them. So they have this zigzag they had to serpentine they had to work through. And they would oftentimes try to do the same thing, and they would kind of chase each other back and forth through these barricades. But I have some other descriptions which might help with that. I'll read two different things here, kind of give you a sense of how this worked in reality. So March 20th, 1863, this is from Colonel John Irvin Gregg to just Sir, so we don't know exactly who he's writing to, but he was the regimental commander of the 16th Pennsylvania we talked about a few minutes ago. It was a brand new regiment, and probably writing to his brigade commander. I report that in pursuance of instructions from division headquarters, I visited the line of cavalry outposts from the extreme right to the center. I found the vedettes vigilant and, with a single exception, well instructed, the reserve in condition to resist an attack. I would respectfully suggest, for the information of the general commanding, that sufficient attention has not been given to the obstruction of the roads which traverse the woods in every direction. In my last report, I asked that 100 axes be sent out immediately to complete the obstruction. I repeat the request. I find that the road leading from Hartwood Church, so we talked about Hartwood Church earlier, and the Stafford Road, and he goes into some detail that wouldn't mean much to anybody here, which is a good road and perfectly practicable for cavalry and artillery, is picketed by a corporal and 3 men. This is the road on which I recommend in my report of the 8th a reserve of 25 or 30 men be placed, and on which I ordered, and he names a captain in the 1st Massachusetts, place a guard of 1 officer and 25 men earlier. I ordered the road be thoroughly obstructed today, and that a sergeant and 6 men be placed upon the road. So one of the things that Whitaker talks about there is the ability to obstruct the road, where they're going to, he talks about cutting trees down and what have you. Well, the men had been, and we don't know how these orders carry over through the length of the war, but just in a couple instances, you just saw Greg talk about axes. A month earlier than that, on February 23rd, 1863, another brigade commander in the same area wrote, in compliance with orders from Corps headquarters, each regimental commander of the brigade will at once organize a pioneer party to consist of a sergeant, a corporal, and 20 men. 15 of the men to carry axes and the remaining 5 to carry spades. The axes and spades will be carried slung across the shoulder in leather pouches. Regimental quartermasters will put in requisitions for the necessary tools and materials. The pioneers will remain with their companies but will be exempt from all other details. And then he goes on to say where they would ride in formation. So we have a sense that they were, that this was all being carried out to some extent. The Army is going to become much more adept at building barricades and trenching and things like that as the war goes on into 1864. And just one last thing, on April 5th, 1863, the colonel of the 17th Pennsylvania, which I talked about a few minutes ago, writes to an adjutant of his division commander. The number of men on detached service from the regiment at different places is as follows. So this kind of goes into how the cavalry was used for other things in total.
Right.
1 squadron of men, that's 2 companies of men, at the headquarters of the 5th Army Corps, numbering 121 men. So there's 121 men who are guarding at the commander of the 5th Army Corps, providing escort and courier duty for him, not getting any training. Right. So this is a regiment that's never had any training. They're still new to the regiment, to the Army. They're not getting any training, and they're on escort duty. In addition to that, he goes on, numbering 121 men at Corps headquarters. That's General Stoneman, 2 men. At division headquarters, 32 men. At brigade headquarters, 9 men as teamsters. At division headquarters, 35 men, making a total of 199 men detached from the regiment. So 200 men roughly out of a full regiment who are doing miscellaneous duty, not getting any trained, And from both levels, as we've talked about, they revert to that. That becomes, well, that's all I have to do.
Yeah.
I don't need to train. I can hit back here, you know,
Right.
get better food. I'm
Yeah.
out of the weather. And he goes on, he says, besides the above detached men, the regiment has 150 men on picket duty, 30 men daily patrolling a particular road he names. The regiment was mounted and equipped at Washington, D.C., on or about the 17th day of December, 1862. So from 17 December to April 5th, this is what he's talking at the timeline. On the day following, it was ordered to join the Army of the Potomac. So the day it's mounted, they cannot possibly have any mounted training,
No.
any training with their equipment, because one day after they get it, they're going to the Army, and then they're going to picket duty and all the other things. The whole regiment has not been together one entire week since it left Washington, consequently affording very little opportunity for drill. I would respectfully request that the regiment be kept together as much as possible to afford an opportunity for proper and thorough drill. So those are the challenges that when you take the cavalry and go, oh, you're just good for picket duty,
Stuff, yeah.
and then you expect them to perform well in combat with an enemy who's been
Yeah.
in combat and has been training for a period of time, and they have no, and you know better than I do, you do this and I don't, the maneuvers that the cavalry needs to be able to do and do
Well.
instantaneously. It has to be done
Yeah, it takes a lot of practice.
right. So when you're maneuvering men and horses, you know, going from column into line or whatever it might be, they need a lot of repetition, I think, to learn to do that. And as you see there, 4 months later, they haven't at it. Well, April 5th of 1863, that's basically 2 months before the Battle of Brandy Station. That's after the Battle of Kelly's Ford. That's on the verge of the summer campaign, the Gettysburg campaign. And you think of all the cavalry combat that's going to take place
Yeah, that whole
within,
yeah.
and then you realize that's their state of training.
Yeah, which basically none.
None.
I mean, so a week. He said not even haven't even been together as a regiment for a week.
Right.
Unreal. So, which is interesting because when you combine that with Stanton's order again, it's really interesting that
The complete
opposite.
Right.
You know, which I guess maybe is what prompted Stanton to, because that was what 64 when he sent.
Stanton gives the order in 64, a year later.
Maybe that's that reason is because that's happening. You know.
And as we've said, I don't follow the cavalry in this kind of granular detail
Right.
into 64 and 65. It takes a lot of time to dig these records out.
it does. Yeah.
They're not as prevalent because the men just didn't write and keep the records as well as they did earlier on. So whether they were still doing picket duty in 64 in June to the same extent or not is a little harder to know. My guess is they probably were.
Yeah. I want to go back to one random fact you said. You read one of the orders or one of the reports that basically instructed these cavalry regiments to put together a
Pioneer Corps.
basically a pioneer group, which they have axes and spades and all that kind of stuff. And I find that interesting because even in Whitaker's writings, he actually writes that. So toward the end of his writings, he actually says, "But there ought to be an axe in every squad for this." And then he says it again, "and there ought to be." And when you combine that with what he says earlier on, he actually really goes into pretty great detail of how to set up a vedette or picket duty in heavily dense forests. He actually says the trees should be felled in a straight line about 50 feet apart or less if necessary, the underbrush behind thrown over, and the paths cut. Between the paths or underbrush should be left and further entangled to cut things to the pass. He says behind the breastworks, a path should be cut behind each vedette by which he can retreat of the picket if attacked, and a second path should run along the picket line behind the obstacles to be patrolled on. And so he really talks about throwing up those breastworks along the roads. Again, he kind of focuses on making sure that roads are kind of the heart of these breastworks. But then goes on to say that all this woodworking should be going on, which kind of is nice because that goes supported by the first-hand account that you read before about having a pioneer corps, and then of course with Whitaker ending his chapter here with every squad should have their own axe. Now, as a living historian or a horseman myself, I'm trying to figure out how to carry a full-size axe for each squad, which is interesting because that's something I honestly haven't seen, haven't done myself. I'll have to kind of reevaluate kind of how we do that. But I mean, obviously, the ability to cut trees and establish breastworks, and of course, this is written in 71,
Right.
And I'm sure a lot of what his lessons learned are probably in 64 and 65 when just entrenchment became
Second nature.
I mean, how many books and how many other references and regimental histories basically said that toward the end of the war, every time a unit or a regiment or the corps stopped, that, like you said, before they even start boiling coffee, they entrench,
Right.
And so I'm sure that had something to do with filtering Whitaker's comments on this. But how do you, combine just what we've been talking about as vedettes or picket duty in general with his focus on the forest, how to do these pickets in the forest? Like, what are your...
Well, I think, as you said, he's looking to the next conflict that he sees, and he sees it in a heavily forested area.
Yeah.
And so much of the overland campaign in 64 is through a forested area. As you said, they got into this. So this is the latter part of his service is still maybe the most fresh in his mind. That did not happen earlier in the war as much. But there's something to balance out here, I think. So, a squad, if you break down a company has what, 2 platoons, I think. Probably wrong, maybe, but you go from company to a platoon and then down to a squad. Well, if you start having an axe in each that far down, you're adding that much more weight to a man and a horse. Well, they knew that one of the things they had to learn was to shed weight.
Yeah.
To carry less weight into battle with them. So again, they had to find that perfect point of what are enough axes. We know that this has already been done. What we don't know is in 64, we don't have any orders from them that I've seen. So it had been done earlier. Was that carried on? There's no reason for me to think that it wasn't, especially when we know that, as you said, it became second nature to start entrenching. And for the cavalry to some extent, not to the extent that the infantry did it, but they were still going to throw up fence rails or some kind of a barricade to fight behind, and they would throw dirt and other things over it. So maybe not as heavy because they weren't carrying that kind of equipment with them. But you're adding more weight to your horse, and so there's a point in which you can go too far with it. And part of the other thing that's, I think, has to be kept in mind is in the actual outpost guide that was issued in, I think, February of 1863, they talk about barricading this stuff, but it was to be done kind of without the enemy's knowledge. You don't want them to know where your lines were if at all possible. So if you make it too big a deal and you're cutting down 50-foot trees and you imagine what it's going to take to cut down a 50-foot tree with an axe, that's not going to be a secret.
No,
So there had to be a balance, and I think he's kind of taking the idea of the overland campaign, the latter stages of the war, the Petersburg campaign, where they're just constantly entrenching, placing it to where there might be a conflict in the future, and maybe taking it just a little bit too far. But in reality, we know that axes had been issued. They had pioneer corps within the regiments, and
that's good. So I mean, basically that's all I had to cover. I mean, really, kind of pretty simple. I mean, it's interesting, but picketing in general, that's pretty much what Whitaker has to say. Anything else you want to add to that conversation? Or?
No, I've enjoyed our time together.
Yeah,
I appreciate the opportunity to come out here and talk with you. And
welcome to God's country.
There you go. Yes, indeed.
Right. No, again, thank you so much for coming and participating, talking and spending these hours with us. So
it's been a pleasure.
Awesome. Well, again, I appreciate you guys watching. Hope you guys, again, enjoyed these series. If you did, please like us on Facebook. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Comment below and see if there's something you want us to talk about. Let us know. And, of course, until then, ride hard.